Hi, I'm Alanis Morissette, and welcome to Conversation with Alanis Morissette. Today's special guest is Alexandra Katehakis. She has a doctorate in human sexuality from the Institute for Advanced Study of Human Sexuality and is a licensed psychotherapist with a 1997 graduate degree from Antioch University. In 1997, Alexandra Katehakis was one of the early pioneers in the field of sex addiction. She is also part of the clinical team at the Meadows Inpatient Trauma and Addiction Rehabilitation Center in Arizona, and the author of Erotic Intelligence and Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation, as well as co-authoring a book with Tom Bliss called Mirror of Intimacy, as well as Making Advances, a comprehensive guide for treating female sex and love addicts. Alexandra is a licensed marriage, family therapist, certified sex therapist, and supervisor. She is the founder and clinical director of the Center for Healthy Sex in Los Angeles, California. She serves on the faculty of sexuality certification organizations and consults for major treatment centers. She specializes in and has extensive experience in working with a full spectrum of sexuality, from sexual addiction to problems of sexual desire and dysfunction for individuals and couples. She can be found at centerforhealthysex.com. It is my pleasure to welcome her to the show today. Welcome to the show today. Alex Katehakis is joining me right now. Such an honor to have you on the show. Your brain and your spirit and your activism and teachings around this highly, at times controversial topic, a deeply integrative conversation that you've led and participated in around sexual recovery from not only sex addiction, but describing to the world what sex health looks like, healthy sexuality looks like. Thank you so much for joining me here, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Alanis. And thank you so much for your recognition of my struggle to try and take an integrative, holistic approach to this very complex and sometimes gnarly problem.
Yeah, and I think it's a testament to your being able to come at this from neurobiology, biochemistry, the history of people's perceptions academically on sex addiction and how that's evolved over time. Your book, Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation, was really exciting for me, and just diving into it and coming at it from the academic side, and then your capacity to be able to speak in a language that really connects, certainly for me on a personal level, and for those that are actively wanting to find out and embody in a holistic way, as you just mentioned, from the brain and the body to the spirit, to the hormonal, to all of it. It's so integrative. And I really think that's sort of leading edge approaches to any version of healing. We are such a multitudinous creature. So to leave any stone unturned is to have, in my mind anyway, have recovery be semi incomplete. So
yeah, I would agree. The field of recovery has certainly come a very long way.
Yes,
and
exciting.
Today we know that if you're treating addiction, you're treating trauma. So it's much more complex than it was, back in the day when Bill W. started Alcoholics Anonymous.
The whole idea of even, whether Peter Levine or Bessel van der Kolk or a lot of people who've done even more sort of linkages and integrative fleshings out of Peter and Bessel's models. It's just been so exciting that it's become sort of ubiquitous in culture in general to even use the word trauma. I remember teaching a few years ago, and in the description of what I was teaching, they kindly asked me to not use the word trauma. Whereas now the word trauma is heard in a lot of circles, which is really exciting to me.
And you're remiss if you're not using it or treating it.
Yeah, you're not sort of on the leading edge of this really potent conversation. So the first thing I would love to do with you here in real time is just define where it is that we could possibly go, and then work backwards from there if you're up for it. So just really defining what healthy sex is, and I love that you use the word erotic around the definition of healthy sex. So if someone asked you to do your elevator speech in an elevator, what would you say to them if they said, "What's possible for us"?
Well, I think we've only begun to tap our human potential when it comes to sexual health. And It's such a complex topic that
no
even
kidding.
Jumping off is a tricky
You
point.
can't.
But,
yeah.
Right. So when people say, what is healthy sex? I'll often say, well, what is it for you? Because what it is for you is different than what it is for me. And what it is for you is different every decade of your life because our bodies and our psyches are shifting and changing constantly. So the question is about the quest for my own personal sexuality, my own personal sexual potential, and what aligns with my values and preferences and sexual orientation so that I'm in my integrity and I'm in congruence. And I think when people are congruent with what they're doing, then they can start to experience sexual pleasure and they can unleash the erotic. As long as shame is on the landscape or in the picture in any way, then, the person's going to have trouble.
Right. And it's also, I'm assuming, dictated by our degree of consciousness and the degree to which we even want to bring in, what you call the full sexual potential of sexual, of union. The erotic spirit of sexual union was a quote that you had written in one of your books that I found so gorgeous. And I'm assuming that it's case by case, human by human. And there's a whole range of what could be called healthy sex. And if there's an undercurrent to all of where healthy sex could be defined from my direct experience or my experience of not having had it, frankly, or reading your work and beholding your work, it's the idea of respect being part of the dynamic. Would you say that's a big piece of what would have to underlie the healthy version of sex for anybody?
Yeah, I think that's crucial. And I think until we have gender equality, we're going to have a hard time with that.
Yes.
This idea that all these power plays that we've heard in the media recently, but this idea that the masculine and the feminine are coming together in a union of respect and exploration, not dominance and submission, although dominance and submission
with
are
respect.
Energies.
Yeah.
That's right.
With respect can be super fun and hot.
Yeah, that play out during sex. Yes. And they should. But trust and safety and respect are all crucial for the foundation of that.
And you're describing, so I don't want to leave that one. That's a huge one. The idea of trust and safety and respect. I mean, we could dive into the idea of what creates safety and what creates trust. And we certainly will to some degree. But you're speaking about the masculine and feminine. I think of it in terms not only in the gender itself, in whatever someone chooses to identify as, right, but also with the masculine and feminine within one's own self.
Precisely.
And in my experience, being more both sort of on the androgynous sort of area of the continuum. It's so much fun on a personal level for me to have played with that my whole life, playing between the dominant and the submissive. And again, with the empowerment and the respect as a foundation, it is a gender conversation. And if there is no acceptance of the feminine within ourselves, and I see so much of that as being riddled throughout this conversation in pop culture around this huge movement of a lot of women coming and speaking out, a lot of men, frankly, coming and speaking out as well about sexual assault and sexual abuse. And I'm curious how you feel about the idea that is really controversial in this moment anyway, which is people being lambasted for having waited a certain amount of time. I'm curious what your response to that is. I certainly have one, but I'm more curious in this moment about your response to it, because with regards to trauma, how that plays into it, and a context of safety being the sort of prerequisite in order for people to come out and speak about what's happened with them. And that might require a decade or two, depending upon the context of where patriarchy is in the world. So there I was just sharing my take on it, but I want to hear what you might respond to someone who says, why are these people waiting? Why are these women waiting?
Well, I think it's multifaceted, as you said. There's the micro, which is the individual, how assertive they feel, how much they were sexually traumatized or shut down as children, which would align with how assertive they are, and then the cultural context that's wrapped around that. So I think for women, and when we were talking about this paradox of masculine and feminine energies that exist in all of us. When you've got someone tipping too far to one or the other side, you get this imbalance, and we're talking about holism here. So if a female is overly identified with the feminine and she has to act and behave and submit a certain way, she's never really going to be able to bring forward her assertion, her aggression, her capacities that are really powerful in the feminine. She's going to be imbalanced. And that female is prey for the overly identified male energy, the narcissist, the power-hungry, left-brain dominant male.
Yeah, I call that the disempowered masculine. So the disempowered feminine, see, because on the continuum, I think there are some women who really feel better on, with the scales tipped toward more of the feminine aspect. But the difference from what I've noticed in my own self and in my friends is that it's a disempowered version of femininity. And it's,
it is, absolutely.
It's learned.
And it's learned, it's socially constructed.
Yeah.
So that female is going to have a very difficult time coming forward and say, that man just assaulted me, because she's scared and she's afraid he'll assault her again, or he'll shut her down, or he'll name her a liar.
Or seek vengeance around very survival based things like money and career and and reputation. I mean, these are at the fiber of the egoic identity that makes up self, so if that's going to be annihilated, or, vengeance is going to be sought upon that. I mean, that's annihilation, that's death. Right. So there's a lot of reasons not to speak up. And I think because of how safety in numbers has created a platform for people to feel as though if they come out with information that they've sat on and potentially had a lot of shame around, that they're safer to do it now because there is this safety in numbers. And by the way, we're not quite there yet.
But yeah, it shouldn't go missed on anyone that there had to be this Greek chorus of women and men coming forward in order for everyone to stop dead in their tracks and pay attention that this is actually happening. And it's been happening from the beginning of time. This is not news.
Yeah, it's happened with me since I was single digits. I mean, it's
sure. So
you describe these 3 stages of sexual health creating, for lack of a better term, as starting with, I'm curious if this is linear, it likely isn't, but if it goes from healthy to intimate to erotic,
right?
With spirituality kind of being the platform upon which this journey can even be precipitated by, in theory. So would you mind diving into these 3 and letting me know where you're coming from when you describe it as such?
As you say, it's linear, and publishers want things in neat order. They want, 7 keys and 5 steps. And but the idea for that came from really working with people who had been tampered with sexually as children, or who had used sex destructively in ways of, as adults, as sexual addicts, or identifying as being sexually compulsive. And so when people start to reintegrate sex into their lives, starting out in a way that's simple and vulnerable and quiet, a sort of a quiet love, a quiet sexuality, can be incredibly frightening for people that are used to using sex as a way to manage their mood or power and control dynamics, or just about getting off. So this idea of slowing way down, of making deep contact with oneself, eye contact with a partner, and just feeling what it feels like to be touched, seen, affectionate, even to be sexually aroused, and maybe to have intercourse or not. But to just notice, it's really like a mindfulness practice where everything's slowed down, to just notice what the act of sex feels like, because it's not that complicated. It can be a very simple little thing that culminates in orgasm or not. But the act of being in consort with another, of deep connection, is where the starting point of this is. Again, sort of the foundation of where people can start to re-experience their sexuality and move it towards more intentional practice.
And I love how you describe vulnerability as being a doorway or a portal of a kind to eroticism, and that slowness. And for me, and perhaps for some others, a grief almost in saying goodbye to the presentational or performance-based sexuality part and welcoming this authentic, vulnerable, as you said, being willing to tolerate that tension or that discomfort or the awkwardness or the terror, frankly, of intimacy, and how
being seen.
Yes. Oh my God.
Is what it is. Yeah.
Terrifying. As much as I and some have said that we want it so badly, it's absolutely terrifying. And I think the terror really is the fear of annihilation and death. If I track it all the way back.
Yeah. If I'm rejected, if you don't love me, what if I'm shamed? What if you shame me? It's all of that. And most of us as adolescents and in our 20s, we're just in performance-based sex because it was fun and we had athletic bodies and, it was all about experimentation. And that's great for a certain period of time. But if we're really wanting to evolve into a deeper sort of knowing of ourselves and others. And this is not for immature people.
No.
There are people that say we have the best sex of our lives in the 5th and 6th decades of our lives because we have higher capacity for intimacy, self-compassion, connection.
It's more holistic, like you described. And
that's right.
The lust sort of, I loved how Patrick Carnes described the staying stuck in the lust stage of love as courtship disorder, which I loved.
And any kind of problematic sexual behavior, exhibitionism, voyeurism, all of that is a courtship. He talks about it as courtship gone awry, where people are stuck in these adolescent loops because they didn't get to develop sexually appropriately.
And I love how you also said how we're raised, the attachment, how well the attachment stage development went, really dictates and correlates to how we are sexually. And I loved that it might be more obvious, the more overt versions of sexual abuse, the correlation between that and how we either act out or go all the way to sexual anorexia. The direct correlation there is more obvious, but I was fascinated by the idea that how attachment went in general can dictate how we are with our own sexuality. If there's shame in our beingness, and how that affects our sexuality too. And that, oftentimes sexual abuse certainly will affect us later, but that neglect in and of itself, neglect or abuse in other forms can affect our sexuality too.
Right, greatly. And, of course, this is the developmental work of Dr. Alan Shore, where we see that these systems, our autonomic nervous system, meaning the body, is setting up, along with the central nervous system, the brain and the spine, in utero and in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. So the mother's stressors are being encoded in the infant's brain and body from the get-go. And then you've got these micro assaults in infancy when they're not repaired that starts to set the stage for how this human being is going to be able to regulate or not regulate their emotions, their activation systems. And then you get a child who's growing up in a family where it's less than nurturing, less than optimal. If there is physical, emotional, sexual abuse or neglect, who's going to have to find other ways of soothing him or herself. And that's when people, children, adolescents turn to alcohol, drugs, sex, shopping, eating disorders, you name it. Any of the isms that we see later in life, we can largely track back to childhood abuse or early infantile abuse.
Of any kind, not just sexual abuse. I mean,
yes.
It's exciting too. The PM Melody talks about how there's overt sexual abuse, which, sort of comes across as a more obvious version of it. But then the covert versions that are more verbal or energetic or
exactly,
it's really fascinating to me. And if you don't mind just touching on the 4 coping skills, these different kinds, when you speak about regulation, I would love for regulation, if I had my way, that the idea of regulation and how not only what it is and defining it here with you, but also just mentioning the 4 coping skills, the first one being sort of the auto-regulation, sort of the isolation and fantasy one. And then, I'll crassly go through them, but I would love for you to share with me, your take on the whole idea of regulating in a healthy way. But the second one being unhealthy, active use of substances or processes or people, as in with love addiction or sex addiction. The third one being the self-regulation, which is the healthy passive coping skills like meditation and, for me, rest and warmth and journaling and therapy. Right. Actually, therapy is more of the 4th, which is the interactive regulation, getting being brave, basically, and reaching out to others. And for me, reaching out to appropriate others, that was another part of my own maturation process.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of your book as affect dysregulation. So the idea of regulating our nervous system is a new part of the conversation of sex addiction, just for the pop culture in general.
Right.
I think.
Yeah, it is,
yeah.
because it was originally conceptualized as a behavioral problem, the way all addictions were, and then it became a cognitive behavioral problem. So what are you thinking and what are you doing? And stop doing what you're doing that's problematic and change your negative thoughts. And all of that is super helpful for people in early recovery. But if people are going to have long-term stability, they have to start to dig deeper into these affective, bodily-based states. And so children that grow up in the kind of dysfunctional homes we're talking about learn what we call autoregulation. Thumb sucking is autoregulatory, and children do it, but if it's the only way they can get calming and soothing, it means they're not getting the eye contact, the loving tone of voice, the gesture, the facial expression from the primary caregivers. And so that's how the nervous system starts to set up. So autoregulation can be super unhealthy when it's the sole form of feeling good about yourself. So that can be through masturbation, biting your nails, sucking your thumb,
pulling your eyelashes out.
Exactly. Picking at yourself, all of those things where you can actually see that human being really just needs to be touched. They need to be hugged. They need to be held. You know that with your baby, right?
But the challenge with that is the rock and the hard place element of this one, because if touch was associated with abuse or with, recalling these traumatic events for someone, the very thing that would soothe in theory is the very thing that's kind of pushed away, and it creates this sort of ambivalence around, the ambivalent attachment.
Right.
I want this, but I'm pushing it away. And then it shows up in our adult relationships. And when you're working with someone who comes in with the sort of come here, go away, I need, but I'm pushing you away. Is there a direction that you go in that you find yourself inviting them onto?
I mean, I think that requires a lot of patience on the therapist's part, and a lot of willingness to tolerate those oscillations and then to name them and notice together what's happening. Because in a therapeutic dyad like that with somebody who's that ambivalent, there are going to be moments when they're super clingy towards the therapist, and they feel they're afraid of abandonment and don't want to be left, and also disgusted at the notion that the therapist might want to give them a hug or touch them or care about them too much. Like the closer the therapist gets emotionally, not through touch typically.
Although these days more.
Yeah, well, right. But the more hyper aroused the client will get, and those are the conversations between the two that have to be had. And that's a long-term therapeutic relationship, but that person will change over time. And ultimately, the greatest healing cure is to get into a stable love relationship where those dynamics play out with someone who can just hold you. And that person that's ambivalent has to tolerate the feeling they have in their body of wanting to run away from that hug. And to breathe and start to relax into it, because the autonomic nervous system, like the central nervous system, is plastic, meaning it can grow and it can change and it can adapt. And over time, that capacity for touch gets greater and greater.
So slow is key. And
that's right.
Have you found with people, with patients or clients that come in to speak with you, that if one person comes in with either a sex addiction or a history of abuse or trauma around their sexuality, that oftentimes, I'm curious to what degree, that their partner has a complementary relationship with their own sexuality that just kind of makes the journey. It's a journey that can be had with courage and tenacity and patience and, so many mature capacities. But do you notice that there's often a complementary element between two people who are sitting in your room as a couple?
Yes. I mean, there are many, many couples therapists that have named this over the years, the imago work that you marry your match, or Stan Tatkin saying that your bite fits my wound, perfectly.
Yeah. The turtle and the hail.
Exactly.
Yes. There's many amazing metaphors that all resonate. I mean,
we choose people even unconsciously. We recognize what we know However we got love is how we're going to do love. And so people have the opportunity in the relationship to really grow themselves up. And this notion of the happily ever after myth is one of the ones that definitely has to go and burn.
Yeah.
Because it's really...
Well, you have to get rid of 99% of Hollywood movies, songs. Yeah. Although there is a little bit more realism now in a lot of songwriting.
Yes. But I think it is about buckle your seatbelt, because this is going to be intense. You're going to feel like you're burning up through the Earth's atmosphere, but in that burning, you could say it's sort of a holy fire, that you are burning through your issues in relationship to another so that you can grow and change.
Yes.
So a relationship is about growth and change. It's not about some bliss trip.
Well, ideally it is the ones that last, and to complete the 3 stages of love that we touched on a second ago. Lust and this sort of courtship era and fun, but perhaps less mature than where we could go, segues into romantic as a second stage, and then eventually into a long-term, what I deem to be sort of a mature, brave, stick through the tension, tolerate the conflict, attempt to quell the reactivity on my part. It's
right.
And so my curiosity is, if we go back and if we look at codependence of sex addicts or partners who've been with sex addicted partners, I guess that if there was a quality that would precede actual growth being able to happen, it's that both people really want to have to address this. Because I remember having dived into multiple relationships. I'm ashamed and also not ashamed at all to say that I've been in a lot of those relationships. And as I thought the rubber was just beginning to hit the road, that was when they thought it was ending, because the invitation was to segue to the romantic, to the long term, to look at both of our complementary issues or whatever it was. I don't like the issues so much, but what was presenting. So I guess for people who may be sitting across from you, I'm curious if the way to begin requires both people being on board with this journey, or if you had people come in with great resistance and determination to end the relationship, and then it's shifted before your very eyes with your working with them.
Yes. I mean, I think you got to be able to take the heat if you're in a relationship. And when couples come in and there is sex addiction in the picture, and one person has a history of destructive sexual behaviors and the other person just finds out for the first time, I mean, it really is like a train wreck. There's so much profound pain because the partner, the betrayed person, has been living in a parallel universe, having no idea this person has had a second life going on simultaneously. So those relationships, I always talk about, this marriage is over. The marriage you are in is done now, and you have an opportunity to renegotiate this to something better. And I've watched people that were really committed to their own personal growth and development restore their marriages to something beautiful, because the truth is out. They know everything about each other and about themselves for the first time. And if one person is not interested in going on that ride, or I should say climbing Mount Everest,
yes,
bleeding, scraping their way to the top, it's not going to work. It just doesn't work out. So people have to really share the same values above all. Love is important, but they have to have the same value system and the same desire to take this trip together.
Yeah, I'm assuming that that a lot do and some don't, right?
Some don't. That's right. Well, they say that 80% of all partners who say they're going to leave don't, which is a pretty high, statistic.
That's really heartening. Thank you so much for just saying that.
Yeah. And I think that speaks a lot. I think, these are predominantly women. So that says a lot about women and how strong women actually are and how forgiving we can be. And just for the record, women are typically not that upset about the sex. It's the lying that we can't abide. Women are not that, prudish about sex workers or prostitution. We don't like affairs because that's a matter of the heart.
The heart, yeah.
But the constant lying and gaslighting and feeling like you're crazy, that's what becomes egregious over time.
Yeah, the erosion of trust too. And that's such a platform that all of this ideally is based on as the growth work continues. And how have you noticed trust being sort of reemerging in a context where it was obliterated by affairs or sexual actings out?
Well, the partner who is the betrayer is the person who really has to earn that trust back by being accountable, by having high levels of empathy for the upset of the partner, the roller coaster of emotions that person is going through, from loving them to hating them to never wanting to see them again to wanting them to not leave, all of that, because it's a relational trauma. The attachment system has been attacked and is under siege. And the person that you thought you trusted more than anyone in the world, that had your back, that you could rely on, you just found out that you have no idea who this person really is. So it's incumbent upon that person to earn the trust back, not by what they say, but by what they do, what their behaviors are, how they show up, how hard they're working on themselves. And that takes time.
And does that show up in terms of them literally physically showing up for perhaps therapy and taking shared responsibility, which is such a cornerstone? I'd love to sort of lay out the 4 cornerstones of intimacy as you've described it. One of them, to fill people in on these 4 cornerstones that you speak of, the first one being self-knowledge. And so many of us, and I would imagine a lot of people who come to you, come without a large amount of the self-knowledge that is required to create this foundation of trust.
Well, sure. I mean, if you're in addiction, you have no self-knowledge. You're running from what you know, which is your pain.
Right. Yeah, which I totally understand if there is no self-knowledge. And we're, this culture, as I see it, is not a culture that wants to cultivate self-knowledge as a virtue, because not only are you deemed selfish if you seek understanding of self egoically, spiritually, and otherwise, but, it's also for me as a servant, as someone who loves the micro and macro and loves bouncing between them in my art and just in how I live. The whole idea of growing my self-knowledge, I've had some ambivalence around it. On one hand, I want to grow the egoic sense of self, and have self-care be an active part of my maturation process. And then on the other hand, I was apprehensive, less so now in today's culture, where self-care is kind of trendy, which is so awesome. I love it. So self-care and all these things now are actually helping this agenda of healthy sex coming to the fore. So self-knowledge being one of them. And then the second one is comfort and connection. And for those of us who are in relationships where connection is, little tiny fits and starts, glimpses here and there, but isn't this sort of steadfast current, how to cultivate connection for me around being non-reactive with my partner, not taking things as personally. I mean, I say this as though it's the easiest thing to do, but if there's a lot of trauma and a lot of triggering and a lot of sort of recalling past sexual traumas for me, it's like for me to be responsible, which is another cornerstone of intimacy on your 4 cornerstones of intimacy. It's the whole idea of being responsible, being someone who is able to even connect from a place of knowing self and being able to assert needs and wants and what I value and what integrity even means to me. And I mean, this all requires a version of maturation that is not for the weak of heart.
It's not, right. So even, this matter, if we go back to knowing oneself, that there is a paradox in this. And, it's even this is in Hinduism, this knowing of oneself. There's the small self and the large self. And we don't want, this is not about egoism or left brain power dynamics or narcissism. It's a quiet knowing and an interest in self-reflection and being able to solidly say, this is who I am. This is what I like. This is what I don't like. And I'm not going to impose it on you or badger you or shame you because you don't like the same thing. I just can't be with you because that's not who I am.
Right.
And I think that is a form of, evolution in addition to maturation. And being able to,
the evolution of consciousness, really.
Yes,
right? Yeah.
It is, right. And there's a paradox to it also, because self-care in our culture, it all gets dumped into the bucket of consumerism. It's just another thing.
Or glamorizing. Yeah, it's like, it's another addiction, so it's walking that fine line of like, am I shopping and dressing up and grooming in a way that's addictive, or am I doing it in a way that reflects my self-care? And I can usually tell by sensation in my body,
Sure.
when I start.
But it's it's also this thing about, well, I know that I told you I was going to meet you to, go do this thing with you, like to help you move or come to your house. But, for my self-care, I needed to go to
Right.
my yoga class. That's where it becomes self-centered and problematic.
Yeah, and what you're describing too is a culture where it almost requires us to touch on what healthy narcissism is, and
yes.
and it speaks to the fourth cornerstone of intimacy, that is empathy.
Right.
And so the idea of being on the end, sort of, if the left is a lack of developed narcissism, which so many of the sort of codependent parts of me is this almost undeveloped healthy narcissism, and then the other end of the continuum, full-blown personality disorder narcissism, it precludes, if we're on that end of narcissism, and I feel like our culture sort of fosters and cultivates narcissism, then we don't have access to the very thing that could create intimacy, which is attunement to another creature across from us, because narcissism has it be such that they're just appendages for us, and they're serving our supply, that
That's
feeds
right.
it.
Yeah.
So for me, I think culture is in trouble around this whole narcissism conversation, specifically around the empathy conversation. That is what is missing so much. And when you just said that example about, I can't come help you move because I have to go to a yoga class, it's so autonomous and individualistic and divisive on a spiritual level too, because there would be a way, if one was willing to collaborate, to do yoga and to help, maybe bring your yoga mat while you're moving.
That's right.
Right. And so the idea of being able to brainstorm with someone and co-create with someone, and, we lose touch with that, with this hyper individualism and divisiveness of us against them, which is mired in sort of the destructive version of ego. So yeah, that whole empathic part is a big deal. So when you have a couple come in and one of the partners errs on the side of being a little more self-absorbed, is there a degree, if someone's got a full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, is it kind of a non-starter for you as a therapist?
Yeah, it's very difficult because you can just look at, as you say, our culture and who's leading our culture today. We are in a highly narcissistic, high-power dynamic. Epidemic right now. And so if somebody has full-blown narcissistic personality disorder, they can't really be helped by therapy.
No, they don't even go to therapy. Really.
They don't go to therapy. There's nothing wrong with that.
They might if money is involved.
That's right.
if they're trying to go to a therapy session to prove that they don't want to give as much money in their divorce settlement or something like that.
But if somebody is narcissistically wounded and so they are dismissive because of what happened to them in their early childhood, teaching somebody to have empathy for their partner is sort of the first step. Unfortunately, it can be taught? It can be taught cognitively, because there's cognitive empathy and there's affective empathy.
So affective meaning emotional.
Emotional, right. Yeah. So cognitive empathy is if I don't know you well and you say, my dog died, I say, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Because I know that's the right thing to say.
So socially intelligent, really, too. Yeah. Emotionally intelligent.
But if I know you well, if we're close and you tell me and you're in tears, I'm in tears with you because I feel your pain and I'm vulnerable with you. And that's what can be missing with couples, especially when somebody has betrayed someone and that person is hurt. The betrayer has to be very careful not to go into shame or get defensive, but to be able to really see and feel how badly they've hurt the other person, and to be able to name that has the other person starting to feel like you get it and you get that you hurt me. And that's the beginning of forgiveness. So it's a challenging road. And I think, there are even sayings in the 12-step program that you fake it till you make it. So sometimes people have to fake empathy by understanding it's the right thing until through their therapy over time, they can start to actually feel.
The idea of having a cognitive empathic experience with someone still is a bit of a mile away from the deep, profound felt sense of connection with someone.
Yes.
It's still a disconnect in a way. I mean, it's probably appropriate in professional contexts and, like you said, with people you don't know, but there have been moments where the cognitive empathy stopped there. So the validation was had of, that makes sense. I could see how you would think that kind of thing.
Right.
But then it wouldn't segue into more of a depth of emotional connection, which for a mature version of healthy love, from how I see it, correct me if I'm wrong, that's kind of a platform that is needed to move in to the intimacy and eroticism that is available to us if we chase it or stay with our eyes on the prize,
Right. But if you've got narcissists raising children, they're going to beget narcissists. And so that is a real problem. It's very dangerous.
Yeah.
And, secure attachment is shrinking in our country. It's not growing. And that's why people have to be very careful when they're dating or getting into a relationship with the other person to pay attention to what's happening in front of you.
Meaning, if you want to build a family, do you mean, in terms of what you'll be teaching the kids? Yeah, because self-absorption, in my experience, is something that can slowly be shifted behaviorally and emotionally. Mm-hmm. My experience of being in direct contact with the personality disorder of narcissism, I couldn't negotiate with the terrorists.
Right,
it's like it's a non-starter,
Yeah.
And I was supply queen. My whole being was just, I'm just going to supply your narcissism. And if things are going wrong, I'll supply more to regulate your nervous system, because, and there is some empathy. I mean, even your book, Sex Addiction as Affect Dysregulation is very, there's an empathy toward the wound of narcissistic personality disorder, the woundedness that births sex addiction, and right now might not be the most popular time to talk about the empathy we have toward it. Right now it's all about, in some ways, and understandably, after hundreds of years of patriarchy and oppression and abuse, I totally get the big fat middle finger. I can't move toward forgiveness yet. Right. I can't move out of my anger. This is the first time I'm standing up. I totally understand that. And then at the same time, the more academic part of me knows that anytime we're acting in a way that is disconnected, it's born from us having been wounded in some shape or form.
Yeah, we all have to look at our part in this mess. This isn't happening in a vacuum. It's not one or the other. All of us are victims. We're all perpetrators. We're all rescuing all of it.
But it's almost like a chapter in a journey of rising up, and that empowerment can look different to everybody. But I agree that violence can't be cured by more violence.
That's right.
However, because of having been in a context of patriarchy for as long as certainly the female gender, period, but but feminine itself, the femininity, the feminine concept itself has been so reduced, and at the same time, the empowered masculine is just coming into the fore for the first time.
Right,
like
I would agree.
Even defining what that is,
is
the future of where we're going to correct all this. So,
right, and I love that men are having to grapple with that.
It's
now.
the best. I can't get enough.
Right,
it's like front row seats with popcorn for me. I'm just like bring it.
Men are actually having to define what it means to be masculine in the 21st century.
I know, within women bodies too, right? And
yes,
so defining. I wrote an article for Time Magazine. I sound my ego just came in there. Wrote an article. Is that okay?
I don't think that's just ego. I think that maybe
it's just information.
Pride.
It's also appropriate to our conversation.
Yeah, sure.
So in it, I was just really writing about this whole conversation in a way, for me, is about really finding the empowered masculine and the empowered feminine. So I completely understand that if the disempowered feminine is coming into empowerment, that the road through which the feminine travels, rage and anger, is totally natural.
That's right.
And so sometimes it's showing up in a way that reduces the journey of the masculine from disempowered masculine to empowered masculine. I think that it's a part of the journey, and I think it's important. It's kind of like telling someone to jump to forgiveness before they've moved the anger somatically out of their body. So I think that's what's happening.
I do too.
And the danger is that it's not giving credence to the journey that is being asked of the masculine.
Right. But I think the pendulum has to swing in that direction. And what you're talking about is also mythologic in proportion, because you think about, Kali in the Hindu tradition, or the fierce goddesses in traditions, the fierce anger of, a woman's wrath, all of that is emblematic of, the power that women have been sitting on for so long. Exactly. It's going to come as rage.
Yes. And so for me right now in this particular chapter, 2018, I just feel like we all need to cut a lot of slack to a lot of people. especially female bodies, and especially the feminine that's been sort of oppressed, and so much has been sublimated. I'm just like, you know what? There's a beautiful rage flailing going on, and I would hate to snuff it out because it's such an important part of the journey. The only danger and sadness that I feel around it is that there's a whole journey that's happening alongside this journey, which is in the invitation for the disempowered acting out violence version of masculinity, that it's being invited on its own journey. And so for it to be pounded on, and maybe it needs to be pounded on as part of our evolutionary process here. But basically what I'm saying is it's important for the disempowered feminine to rage out, because it makes sense on a somatic level, on a nervous system level. I've been silent for so many fucking years. But there's this whole side journey and this invitation for the masculine to come into its own power, and that the protect and provide old version of what masculine was, dominating, all of these things that are rife in sex addiction. Yes. Yeah. Like the reduction of the feminine, or all of the things that are inside of sex addiction. That there's an invitation for that disempowered masculine to be pulled into an empowered version that is modern, that the currency of protect and provide looks different in modern times now.
Yes, I would agree that it empowers women. It doesn't, overpower.
No, and doesn't want to kill, basically.
Right.
Doesn't want to kill the spirit of the divine feminine. So I guess what I'm saying is very Gemini of me here. I love the idea of this rage. I think it's gorgeous. I think it's necessary for the journey. I think it's overdue. It's been in our bodies for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so how could it not explode on some level if we don't make room for what evolution is asking of us? If we don't make room for the definition of empowered masculine, then we're not part of the movement toward what will be available to both men and women bodies, hundreds of years from now, when we're physically no longer here.
Well, I think you're right. I think this is an evolutionary process, and this volcano had to blow.
Yes.
And it's going to blow, and the lava is going to flow.
And we're going to be messy.
It's going to be messy. There will be bodies in the wake of it.
And there are, right? There are bodies right now. And I think this is just the beginning, and whatever it's being called, witch hunt or otherwise, I just think that this explosion is necessary. But you were about to say something.
Well, I'm just hoping, like you, that on the other side of that will be a space for masculinity to be redefined.
It has to be.
And it does have to be. And hopefully, men, I do believe men will step up to that call and start to make those changes, and that we'll start to educate our boys and our girls differently than we ever have before.
Yep. It's already happening. Maybe, what is critical mass is a really small number, right?
Right.
So it's already happening as I see it. I know a lot of men and a lot of more masculine oriented women who can see that the currency of their provision is changing, and that it counts for something to provide to, the more sort of alpha female in their life in a different way than they thought they should be, So I already see it happening in my own experience, and I think it'll just continue to happen, maybe concurrently with the Mount Vesuvius rage, beautiful rage that's exploding all around us. And at the same time, I love the idea of bringing into the conversation the idea of this narcissism and this acting out that is so destructive in sex addiction, in domination, as being born from a woundedness. And I think where the lack of empathy for sex addicts comes from is when it's what you said, when the behavior is egregious, when someone doesn't actually look like they're taking responsibility, maybe they're mired in narcissism. A lot of people are quick to say, right now, especially, sex addiction as an excuse to get out of, taking responsibility. And certainly that's happening. But I would never want that to give a bad rep to the profound work that you are providing around sex addiction recovery, because it is such like you said, it's so complex, it's so multi-layered, multitudinous, and it brings into question every aspect of our humanity, our sexuality, our brains, our nervous systems, our hormones. I mean, it brings in our attachment issues, it brings in everything together. So I just think this portal of looking at the sex addiction challenge in pop culture right now is a portal and a big invitation into consciousness if we but take it up on it. Yeah.
Right. And I think people mistake the notion that sex addiction is an excuse for behaving badly or a way to get out of anything. People who come into treatment, those people who have put themselves into inpatient treatment centers, we talk about sex in inpatient treatment centers or outpatient for a minute, and then we're always talking about trauma and what precipitated these behaviors. And people that are in recovery from sex addiction have to take 100% responsibility for what they've done. That's what recovery is about. It's not about wiggling out of anything. It's the people that don't go to treatment that are wiggling out.
But are there not people who go to treatment, but they're not really actually committed to the growth journey, and maybe perhaps they might be doing it to save face or to...
I don't think so. I think if somebody puts themselves into a 45-day treatment center, they're going to come out the other end changed. They might go in kicking and screaming or thinking it's full of, whatever the first 3-4 days, but at some point there's going to be a click and a shift. I've seen it happen over and over again. I've been doing this work for 20 years.
So heartening to hear you say that. And then you even feel that way about people who have narcissistic personality disorder who are quote unquote forced into...
Not disorder. I mean, if someone's got a full disorder or they're sociopathic, therapy is contraindicated for those people.
Right.
Those are a small fraction of people.
They usually have to go to jail.
Exactly. That's where there's a place for those people, and it's not treatment.
Right. But ideally treatment would be in jail, but anyway.
There's a saying in AA that I've been told about because I'm not in Alcoholics Anonymous, but the saying is that you don't have to get AA gets you. So the act of being in those rooms, of listening, of going to group therapy, of going inpatient, outpatient, what have you, over time, something starts to shift and people start to see, wow, I've been in so much denial and lying to myself about these things, and I really wasn't a nice person. And I do have a problem.
Yes. Having been in recovery for various different processes and addictions throughout my life, I see that how can one not be affected by that deep work, especially with the introduction of trauma and somatic considerations too. And is it safe to say then that those people who have a personality disorder, sociopathic tendencies or whatever it is, psychopathic, narcissistic personality disorder, that almost precludes them from even being able to do the depth of work, and they likely won't even show up, do you think?
That's what I think.
Okay.
They won't show up because, again, people that have that sort of distortion don't think there's anything wrong with them. They think they know more than the psychiatrist, the therapist, the somatic practitioner. They start telling you about psychology.
That's awesome. But so what about right now, a lot of people up in arms about people who are seeking sex addiction recovery formally in rehabilitation centers and yet still saying, I don't have any recollection of this. It was all consensual. So, I mean, denial is just an active part of the early stages of recovery, right? So is that kind of normal as you see it?
Well, I think it is. I think for some people, if they really were drunk and it really was 30 years ago, they really might not remember, honestly. So there's that aspect to it. But I do think if somebody is there and they're in earnest and they start to get it, they start to say, yeah, you know what, I did do those things. I didn't do those things and I don't remember those things, but there's a whole bunch I did do that I'm taking responsibility for. So it's such a case-by-case situation.
And probably a day-by-day too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And some of the amnesia that comes when you're a victim or when you're a perpetrator.
Right.
I mean, there's a heavy amnesia that comes.
For sure. Because of the compartmentalization that's required. That's
to keep
part
going.
of addiction. Yes. It's a component of dissociation.
And the fallout of, this dopamine hit is not high enough. So I have to keep sort of having my behaviors grow in egregiousness, in order to get that high.
Right. That's where the people, start being delusional and out of reality that I'm above the law, or because I am who I am, nobody's going to say anything.
We see a lot of that right now too.
Yes. Yeah. Right.
really fascinating for me, the idea of integrating fantasy into a healthy sexual context, and how in some cases it would be, it could be something that would be enjoyable for both partners. Some cases it might be a little dangerous to tiptoe into that area because it may sort of bring up that euphoric recall of past sexual actings out or sexual abuse, and the curiosity on my part of associations that create arousal based on illicit or forbidden or dysfunctional, for lack of a better term. That is such murky waters in some ways.
It is.
To get a sense of when is fantasy just fun and cool, and when is fantasy just sort of continuing to play out some of the more dysfunctional dynamics, basically, and to circle back to where we started with the whole idea of respect and trust. My sense is that when there is respect and trust as a foundation, then it later on might become something to investigate, and it may or may not work for any given couple from what I read of your teachings and writings.
Yeah, and I think you sort of answered your own question, that when it feels fun and cool, it's fun and cool. And when it feels dirty or toxic or humiliating or shaming, and that's not the intention, that you're aroused by shame and humiliation, then like, oops, I'm out of my integrity here. This is not really true for me. I mean, I think so many of us, all of us, are sexually repressed because we don't want to admit to ourselves what we actually like sexually, and we don't want to explore what we like sexually.
Well, we don't want to hurt our partners, right? Because
we're too busy tracking them instead of being having a solid sense of self and say, hey, I just want to tell you, I think I like having sex with aliens, and your partner might say, oh,
totally
my God,
hot, by the way, totally
right.
Hot.
I didn't know that. You never told me that. And that's where we have to watch our reactivity and our eye rolling, and instead be curious and say, so tell me about that. What do you like about that? It makes me kind of squeamish. I'm not sure I'm down with that, but let me hear more about what turns you on by that. And the act of you being turned on by it may have me saying, I could sort of be interested in that. I'm willing to try it if it's not going to hurt me. And maybe I'll like it and maybe I won't. But at least we're in a dialogue about it. And maybe we'll just end up laughing at how ridiculous the whole thing sounds.
Right.
But there's an intimacy in even having the conversation about it. So I think people have to really track what's happening in their bodies to notice, is this shame that's historical? Is it shame from my trauma? Or is it shame because I'm a little embarrassed that I would actually like that and it's kind of excitatory? Which is it?
You, as a therapist sitting across from an individual or a couple, if you see someone having their arousal associated or connected or based on something that was abusive in their past, I know this is way too complicated of a question for you to answer in one sentence, but where would you even begin with that? Would you begin with trauma work? And
Well, actually, I have a workbook coming out this spring called the Katehakis Integrative Sex Therapy Model.
Only that.
Yes. The acronym is KISSed.
Oh, nice.
And it spun out of my dissertation, where I created a sexual health model for people in recovery from sex addiction. So this workbook is designed for therapists and clients to work through together, and it's somatically oriented. So you're tracking what's happening physically in your body as you're talking about sex acts to see what's what.
To see the degree to which you dissociate, or
that's right.
Okay, get dysregulated,
how arousing it is, how exciting it is, what your sexual values are, your personal values, how these behaviors align with those, or do they contradict them? So it really takes people towards creating a sexual health plan where they feel like, wow, there were things I did in my addiction that were really arousing to me that I want to be able to do again. But I want to do it relationally this time, not in this kind of pornographic, dissociated, shut off way, but in a way that's highly associative, connected, and relational. Because when it's relational, then the erotic can really ensue from that. And then sometimes maybe it is sort of athletic or performance or fun or role play.
Yeah,
but the tether of connection is intact, as opposed to just being devoid and both people being dissociated and just reenacting their traumas or just using each other.
Yeah, like the self is there. and the
Exactly.
self is being intimate and sharing self with another self. So that cornerstone is such a big starter, really, that self-knowledge maturation journey. And then there's a whole other element that I'm curious about how you're integrating this, the whole endocrine system and aging and how hormones change and how our bodies are changing. I mean, that's a big one for those of us who are no longer 21 or 15. I'll get to the whole parenting aspect in a second. But yeah, your take on how to integrate the conversation of the hormonal. I'm assuming some people come into your office or come to your workshops or your talks with this whole consideration of progesterone, testosterone, and how do you address that, or how do you bring that into awareness with people?
Well, I think a lot of people, at least in LA, I don't know where it's like in the rest of the country, but this is a major metropolitan area. So people are very, very much on the forefront of health, fitness, well-being, and anti-aging. And a lot of people are supplementing with hormones today that are bioidentical, both males and females, as a way to keep their, bones and brains and bodies and sexuality vital.
Yes.
So I refer people to medical doctors for that if they're interested in that. But more importantly, it's about there is a grief and loss process, like with any phase of life, where we're letting go what once was and turning towards what is now. And there is a loss of, estrogen, collagen, vitality, but there is an increase in capacity for empathy and wisdom and loving deeply. So there's a trade-off. It's just like at some point you put on a pair of jeans that you were wearing when you were 19 and you're like, these don't fit. Or they're out of style.
Yes.
They're embarrassing.
They're not current for me.
That's right.
And I think
to get rid of that.
Yes. And certainly the grief, I'm in the middle of versions of it myself. And then the idea too of being careful around chasing the vitality,
Yes.
To me, this chase of vitality is, on one end of the continuum, it's, it's part of the value system that is corrosive to all of culture in my mind, which is, we got to stay 21 years old forever,
right.
And not honoring where we are. But then also the real vitality that is available to us now, like you said, with the leading edge bioidentical hormone awareness, being empowered enough to do your own blood work and really get into your own health, which is part of the self-knowledge cornerstone that you describe. But just being careful for me that I don't chase a vitality even as a new way to get the dopamine hit or to get the, I want to be 21 and being out of reality, really.
Right. So it's always about intention. That's what I talk about. Is your intention to put on that dress because it makes you feel beautiful and that you have a sense of dignity and you feel kind of sexy? Or are you going to go out and work the dress? Right?
Work it in a 21-year-old way when you're in your 40s. Yeah. Or
it's
50s.
more about what makes you feel good. And that's true with, your hair color, cosmetic work, all sorts of health. We're extending our lives in unbelievable ways with technology today.
And food and everything. Yeah.
So all of it. So what is enough and how much is too much and becomes cartoonish or freakish because you're trying to fix yourself from the outside in.
Yeah. And that's another part of the maturation process of being in reality with what is. And it's part of the spiritual invitation in so many different religions and spiritual processes too, to not be at odds with what is and being in reality so that the crazy making doesn't drive us into the extreme version of anything in moderation, right?
Right.
So one last thing I wanted to ask you about was the idea of modeling for kids, and how that relates to play. That's probably a two-part question here. Play and novelty, and how, well, let me start with one. I'm curious about your take on the role of play or novelty in relationship and how to give credence to that part without it sort of slipping down the slippery slope into addiction again.
Well, I think, play now is being studied by scientists, neuroscientists, and psychotherapists. There's actually a journal of play now. And I think it's an unbelievably important part of vitality because it's one of the 7 circuits that all mammals have. Again, we are wired for play and play states. And when we are, happy and joyous and free, we can play. And I'm talking about kind of rough and tumble play. For adults, it comes in the form of tickling or pillow fights or jousting with each other.
Or full Nelson.
Yeah, right. And also, certainly humor is a sense of play too, but the engagement of physical play is really important. And I think when people have had betrayal in their sex lives, play goes out the window.
Yeah, giggling stops short.
Exactly. Yeah. And so sex can be playful and fun. It's not just this dour thing or this like super sexy movie kind of sex. It's all sorts of things. It's so important for our brains to play.
And it's part of the vulnerability too, right?
Yes. And part of bringing novelty into a long-term relationship is through play. There's a woman named Glenn Gordon who says, play is love in motion. I just love that saying.
That's precious.
Isn't it? So when we think about how we can bring those play states to our relationship, then we see our partners, we see that child part of them, that impish part, the trickster. And that's what we fell in love with to begin with. So I think it's important to take those moments and be goofy and play tag with your partner in the house or chase them around the house or
flip them over.
Flip them over, whatever, the full Nelson. Anything that gets those kind of energies going, because play and lust are connected. Lust is another one of our circuits. And together that can create a very sexy, fun environment.
I love that. The final question I'd like to end with is the idea of as a parent, on one end of the continuum, there's the parenting style of not bringing anything up, and it's too fraught, it's too embarrassing, or whatever the projection is onto the child from a parent who is at odds with their own sexuality in some form. The other end of the continuum is the violating of boundaries and sexual impropriety and covert and overt sexual abuse. So if we were to get into the moderate sort of functional version of modeling or teaching or conversations with children around healthy sexuality, is there something that you recommend to your clients and patients and audience when you dive into this topic?
Yes. I mean, I think people first have to be comfortable with their own sexuality so they can normalize it. If you raise a sexually healthy child, you're going to start talking to them about their genitals and about pleasure from the time they're 4 years old, because 4-year-olds touch their genitals. They're fascinated by them. They're naked all the time. And so to be able to say, yes, that feels good, and that's something you do in private, and it's okay to do it. It's part of your body. You don't make a big deal about it, but you don't shame the child for it. As they start to go to school, they're going to have crushes in kindergarten. They like a girl or a boy. And, talking about that, it's okay to do that, and teaching them about body boundaries and how other people can't touch your body and your body is yours. And all these age appropriate conversations where, by the time they're 10 or 11, you have to start talking about masturbation and sex because they're going to find out about it if you don't.
Yeah. Someone else will teach them.
That's right. And pleasure is pleasure. And it's a normal part of being a sexual being. And so you talk to your boys about, lubrication and not using your good towels and staining your sheets.
Yes, they're borrowing.
Right.
Yes.
You make it a normal bodily function. And likewise with girls as well, that this is your sexual pleasure. I mean, keep in mind that the sole function of the clitoris is pleasure. That's the only reason we have one.
It doesn't help the baby making part.
That's right. So if you have it, you might as well use it and use it when it's appropriate for you. And be careful about who you let touch it.
Yeah, be responsible around it. And
that's right, to your body. And then what does it mean to have a crush, to start to fall in love, to be sexual? Because our sex circuits start to come online at 14 and 15. It's a high level of sexual exploration. So you can try and crush it, you can shame it, or you can be a good steward of it. And that, I think, is what's important, is that we raise sexually healthy human beings so that everything doesn't seem so secretive, shaming, pornographic, dirty.
Yeah, or even body parts too, yes, like the importance of naming body parts with the actual words that connote what the body part actually is.
Yes.
Because the shaming comes in through the vernacular and through our own projections. Well, thank you so much.
You're
Alex.
welcome.
I'm very grateful to you for sharing as much as you have in general in the world, and then speaking with me today God bless you for the work that you're doing. And
thank you. And same to you. I mean, I really appreciate you using your platform for such great activism and, waking people up and shifting consciousness.
It's my joy to do the deep dive.
I can tell.
And you've just been so gracious, and God bless you in your work.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. It's a joy to share these podcasts with you. I invite you to subscribe and join me on the next podcast. And until then, take care. I'll see you soon. Conventional kid all in